Alan Jensen has been a long-term member of the club. You a lifetime member, I think?
I am a lifetime member.
Yeah, he is a lifetime member, which means he has contributed mightily. He has been our symposium coordinator since I've been a member.
At least 10 or 12 years.
For much longer than I've been a member.
And I have been a part of every symposium we've ever had, either in the hands-on learning center or or as a program director or as the lead coordinator.
So in other words, he knows that.
So if you don't come, he's going to take it personally.
Price goes up June 1st. So anyway, he also happens to be a near neighbor of mine, but he has a very nice shop, dries his own wood, cuts his own wood, so on, and has a really good handle on sort of production turning and good ergonomics and position and so on. So I think we're all going to learn a lot today. So I'll leave that for the introduction because Brandon already gave the long introduction in our newsletter this month. So anyway, with that, thanks, Alan, and have at it.
Thank you. All right. Yeah, as it kind of showed in the newsletter in there, I happened to start turning in 1994 in high school in Doug Schneider's wood shop. So that's kind of how it started. He taught me everything I know, but he didn't teach me everything he knows. So, that's... But shortly after that, he brought a whole bunch of stuff. He brought a whole bunch of ideas into our class, and he started showing us how to turn green wood, and it was really neat. It was right when wood turning started really taking off in the mid 90s, and shortly after that, I was able to go to my first Rocky Mountain Woodturners club meeting, and I got to see Dale Nish, and he turned a natural edge bowl, and I just kind of stuck with it ever since. My father and my grandfather have both been, my grandfather was in woodworking first, and then my father's had a cabinet shop and a home building business his entire career. So I'm a third generation woodworker, and it's kind of been in my veins forever. But I really kind of found a fondness in the bowls. Shortly after I started coming to the meetings, I met Trent Bosch, and at the time, he was production turning salad bowls and selling them. And also, Mike Mahoney was a really big name early on back then, too, and I got to meet him very early on when I was turning. So both of them kind of got me hooked on the salad bowls, and I've been turning them ever since. I've turned everything else about you could make in wood turning also. I've done some spindle work, hollow forms, natural edge bowls, platters, 3 pens, alabaster, some small pieces in alabaster and some talc and some different things, and those were a lot of fun too. Really dusty. But I've kind of made everything over the years, but for a while the gallery market was such that I could make bowls and sell them, and so that really helped out the hobby. I was in college at the time, and making these kind of helped pay for the habit. All of you know how expensive it is. So that helped make it work better for me. I never turned the kind of volume that Trent and Mike have, but I turned enough that I could stay busy, and after 20-some years of turning, sticking with it, I was able to get pretty dang good at it. So we're going to finish turn a blank and try and get something that this one isn't as big as this, but we're going to try and replicate a piece like this. This is a pretty dang big bowl. The only way you can find lumber like this, you have to go cut it yourself, and you have to dry it yourself, or you've got to buy it from somebody who makes them, which I do happen to do, but yeah. You go to the wood bank. You can find the wood at the wood bank, and then you can rough turn it, and then you can dry it. So the rough turning really isn't that much mystery to it. I've actually got club demos on, I don't know if they're on YouTube anymore, but probably, on how to rough turn this. But the real art in these is the finish turning. And it's also where the really hard work comes in, trying to get smooth curves, a clean finish, and especially if you want to put detail in your bowls. I started doing similar things to this. Trent was putting different decoration on his bowls also. The wood we have around here is really pretty, but it's kind of plain compared to what other parts of the country have, where they have cherry and walnut and different woods with lots of color, lots of figure. Our wood is nice, but we needed something to separate our work away from everybody else, especially if you're turning elm, ash. This is an elm bowl here. You know, it's nice, but it doesn't stand out from somebody who might have a walnut bowl next to it. So we add some detail to it, and hopefully maybe we can make our work stand out. So these are some raised beads that are simply painted with milk paint. But it gives it some character and tries to separate our work from somebody else's. So I've tried to come up with things that they weren't always easy. I've done about anything you can think of. I've wood burned them, I've painted them, I've carved them. I've done all kinds of things over the years. And some of them were a lot of work, and it wasn't really worth it, but at the time I didn't really care. It wasn't like I had to make a living making them. That was kind of nice. We've got a rough turned dry blank, which is where we're going to start tonight. You can use the same techniques I'm going to show you here if you start with a chunk of dry wood that you bought off the shelf out here. The techniques are going to be the same to try and get a clean cut. The only thing you have to do is cut the corners off and get it round, and you're basically up to speed with where I am here. The hard thing to do that a lot of people have trouble with is, how do I get this?
It's fine.
A little wear and tear, huh?
Yeah, probably.
So when I turn these, I have a tenon on here, but a lot of the times they warp. So I do not recommend somebody just tries to grab this thing with their chuck again. Some of these, the side will tip. You can have all kinds of things that can go wrong with these. They'll all oval, which means you're only going to grab it at 2 points usually. So you've got to remount this thing and cut a nice, true, clean tenon before you put it in your chuck, or this thing's going to launch out of the lathe on you. And we don't want that to happen. One of the things I do when I'm drying my wood, when I'm drying my bowls, I coat this thing in wax. The green wood sealer. This actually has clear kills on it. It's doing the same job for me, and it was cheaper than the green wood sealer. Also, it has a benefit. It isn't slick. The green wood sealer, when you put it on your blanks and you cut it off and it winds up on your concrete floor, it is slick as can be. You can fall on your butt. This doesn't get slick when it comes off the wood, so there's a benefit there. But a wax on your wood, if you try and put this up against the jaws of your chuck, it'll spin. And also, the jaws are perfectly flat. This is no longer flat inside the bowl. It's oval, it's warped, it's done all kinds of things. So we need something to drive this. Some people have just turned a block of wood. It's kind of half round, stick the bowl up there. It works. They tend to slip. So this is anti-fatigue mat, stuff you buy to put under your lathe. Sometimes I was cutting the corners out to make it fit around my stand. This stuff works really well as a friction drive. It's flexible. It'll fit the shape of the bowl. And with all these little rubber bumpers on here, it'll grip like nobody's business. So it's simply screwed to a chunk of wood with some drywall screws, put it in the chuck, and then that'll be our drive system for this bowl. And if you want to do really big bowls, I would suggest making one of these that's bigger, because you can actually flex the outside on a really big piece. So you have to be a little careful.
How old is that chuck, Al?
How old is it? Yeah. Probably from about 97 or 8, something like that. It's been around the block. There's 2. One thing I am an advocate for is big chucks and big jaws. If you're going to turn bowls, get as big a jaws as you can afford. We have witnessed people turning 20-inch bowls with a 2-inch Nova chuck. I don't recommend it. You can snap that tenon off so easy. Get bigger jaws. They will be a lifesaver in certain cases. The other thing is, before we turn, we're going to fix the lathe. This is a tool rest that came on it. This is the best tool rest in the business right now. These are Steve Centers. So you can see the difference in the profile. If you're going to shear scrape, you want something like this. Stick this in here. Bring the tailstock up. Yep. It's out of the way. And I have a center mark in there from when I turned this. Some pieces will warp bad enough in order to get the most wood out of them. You may have to off-center that and return the bottom. Just make sure you have enough wood before you go and do that. I got a decent amount of wood in here, but this thing did not move that much. This is silver maple from Berthoud. It moved, but it actually didn't. It didn't shift much. Where some pieces, if you cut them way off center from the heart of the tree, you can have a lot of irregular movement in the wood. One side will move more than the other, and they get really lopsided. This one is centered right down the tree. And if you're wondering, this is my live center at home. I got some funny little things on here. These are little gauge marks, and they line up with the tenons. They line up with the jaws on the chuck. This is something Glenn Lucas came up with. So this particular finger here points to a tenon for the big set of jaws. This one is for the set of jaws that are in the chuck here. And all it is an indicator, and you just cut over from that point, and it fits the chuck. And this is actually for 7 or 8 inch diameter jaws that I use for really big bowls, hollow forms. Used it for platters too, different things like that. It's just a handy thing when you're turning lots of bowls or whatever. It's really quick to just line it up with that. Okay, make sure everything clears. And with a round bar tool rest, you can't turn the lathe on and cut it, so you gotta make sure it clears. Can't sharpen this. So we're going to clean up the outside of this. Sweat back grind bowl gouge. Just going to flatten the bottom real quick. So I have the flute pointed. The gouge is rolled over in the direction I'm going to cut, and I'm going to cut with the bottom wing. And I'm going to go down to that next size, next jaw size. And you can be bigger than this. You could be slightly smaller than this, and it'll still fit. But if you're an 1/8 inch bigger than this, that's fine. We don't want to be a lot bigger. We want to keep those jaws fairly closed. It's a pretty, I know a lot of people cover this, but it's a pretty good safety thing. When they make these jaws, it's totally round, and they cut them apart like this. So there's a little bit of space between them. So it's a perfect circle here, and they grip really, really well. You can open it up a little bit. This is still a pretty good hold here. But some of these old chucks like this, you can do this too. These will take fingers off and knuckles off and everything else you can think of so quick. Don't do this kind of stuff. Keep the slides within the body of the chuck. These are the slides on the outside. Some chucks don't allow you to open them that far, but if they do, just keep them closed. That's pretty dangerous. And you're actually only gripping with the corners of the jaws at that point anyway. You lose a lot of your hold, so don't do that. If you need to hold something that big, get bigger jaws. Some of the other critical points are we want to have a nice flat surface here for the chuck to register against, and then we'll cut our tenon here. And I'm going to cut this thing really early. I'm going to cut my tenon really early and define it. If I knock this thing out of whack somehow, my tenon is already cut. I can take it out of here and put it in the chuck and finish it. I don't have to go back, find a new center, recut the tenon, go through the whole thing again. I can just stick it right in the chuck and move forward. I'm going to get rid of just a little bit of this so I don't bump into it. And it's just kind of a peeling cut, pulling the gouge sideways. So this is just a, I'm going to grab the big one. This is just a big pointed scraper. Nothing fancy. But it has a 70-degree angle on it that matches the chuck. It's one of the quickest ways to make a tenon that fits the jaws on the chuck. I don't push it in straight in this way though. I cut sideways into the side grain here. If you go this way, you're going straight into end grain in that bowl, and it'll catch. And if you're turning green wood, one little hint is to get rid of those square corners and round them off a little bit. Stuart Batty kind of also advocated that if you do lose the piece out of your chuck, if you radius this outside corner a little bit, it may not break the tenon. If you leave it square, sometimes it'll snap the tenon off. So, but if you radius this corner on wet wood, it's less likely that the crack will emanate from this corner. So when you're rough turning, I've been rounding these corners off, and it has been alleviating a lot of cracks. So that's kind of a good thing to try there too.
Alan, 2 questions.
Sure.
So on wet wood, do you always try to keep your edges a little bit radiused?
I have been doing that lately, and it seems to maybe make a difference.
Okay.
It helps. Mike Mahoney is saying that the cracks are emanating from the square corners because they dry so fast. The really sharp corners on wet wood. So he said radius them off, and it seems he's having better results. So
nice.
It's worthwhile trying.
So the second question, you're using good-sized jaws, but you're also making a big bowl. Is that the size of your foot that you're going to end up with, or
Nope.
not a consideration?
No, it's not a consideration at this point. I will try to have a tenon big enough that the foot lives inside of here, and I will turn this away when I go to finish the piece, when I turn the bottom off.
Okay.
So I try to leave this bigger than what I need so that I have plenty of wood to play with. A lot of the times the base is going to wind up in this section here, not down in the tenon. But if I wind up having a problem and I have to use the tenon, I try to make sure the tenon's big enough I can use this for the base if I need to.
Okay.
No, I do not let the tenon determine the size of my base at all. And so if I'm after a 1/3 base, I try to make the tenon bigger, 40% or something like that if you can do it. It's especially if you're going to core your bowls, big tenons on there, because that's a lot of stress on the blank. When you're rough turning, you're between centers. But when you're coring, you're almost always working without a tailstock. There's very few of them that allow you to do that. Put a big tenon on there so you don't break it. Not only can you rip it out of the chuck, you can snap the tenon right off of the blank. So as big as you can grab is better. So we got that nice and clean. one thing that's really important is we do not want to have any fuzz of any kind down in the bottom of this dovetail. We want the jaws to fit perfectly flat against this edge. And in fact, this flat surface here is slightly concave so that the jaw hits the outside and it'll close up really nice. It'll make it run true when we turn it around too. Okay, now that's cut. Now we'll move on to rough shaping this and putting some detail on it. So I'm going to stand out of the way. I'm right-handed, but I turn left-handed so the chips go past me. I'm not eating that stuff all the time. I wear a hard hat with a full face respirator when I'm rough turning and when I'm finished turning so I don't breathe all that dust. You can usually get up to about here with one cut getting the rough stuff off, but from here on it's usually a couple passes. You can't push hard into that surface when you're riding the bevel. It'll kick you right off of it. So you kind of have to float your cut through there. It is a bevel riding cut, but you can't really push on the wood. Might have to move that. Sort of works there. Not really. There we go. It's too dark over here. I can't see. One thing we haven't figured out yet. We'll just make another cut. So I got the handle pointing down. The flute's at about 10:30. 12 o'clock's here, so it's over at about 45 degrees this way. And I push a lot with my thumb. My other fingers are behind it, and I'm pushing with my thumb to get it to go around the corner. And I keep it tucked against my hip over here. And I'm just kind of rocking my way around it off of my legs. Try to use some bigger muscles. If you're standing back here afraid of it, you're going to have a wiggly curve going all the way up the outside. But if you can get in here and use some bigger muscles down in your legs and your lower part of your body, you can have a better curve. And I'm just trying to get rid of some of this rougher material and get down to something that's smooth and concentric. You can see this is what we want to avoid. If you can zoom in on that, you can see all that nice torn grain that I made. Look at that. It shows up great in 4K. Isn't that nice? That's even better than what I can see. So these don't have any, not yet. How many of you get this? How many of you get torn grain like this? Yeah, you're lying. So that is what we do not want to have, because that is almost impossible to sand out. You sand and sand and sand and sand, and you put finish on it, there it is. So we want to turn it out to the absolute best ability we can. Ooh, I picked this blank I thought it would be a good demo piece. This tree was really wormy. The other one was worse, so I left it for the firewood people. It's not going to hurt anything. It's small enough. It won't hurt the integrity of this bowl. You know, a lot of people, they like to fill these with epoxy and different things, and that's great. You just kind of clean out some of the things they left behind, and then epoxy. That epoxy works really good. Super glue, this is probably too big of a hole for super glue, so epoxy and something to fill it, regardless what color you want to do, that works great. This is an old Hamlet 2060 gouge. Some of the fancy high-grade steels. Works great for roughing. That's about all I use it for. I don't do any of my fine cuts with these tools. I try to go with some different steels to try to get that really fine cut on here. It's a big gouge. It's 5/8 diameter. I have a 3/4 inch that I use for roughing. I don't use any of those for any of my finish cuts because it's just too hard to get something clean with those. I have smaller gouges will cut clean, and I sharpen them a little different, and they work phenomenally well. I'm also going to flatten the top off right now because it's uneven, and so there's a possibility we could have a little bit of bounce in the lathe possibly because of that. That brings up another point too. When we go to do this finish turning, we don't want our lathe to move. If there is anything we can do to try to keep that lathe as stable as we possibly can, it's going to make our turning better. When I was able to finally graduate from my 16-inch lathe to my 24-inch Vic Marks with the solid steel beds, I have never turned on anything as rigid and as smooth as those, and my turning improved, especially on the interior of the bowls. If the lathe is moving, you're going to get a spiral, and there isn't hardly a damn thing you can do to stop it except stop the lathe from moving, and it's one of the it's not always the easiest thing to do, but it's something that can improve your work right away. So I'm going to get rid of this to try to help alleviate. This lathe's not moving, so it's good, but we'll get rid of this just because it also tells us how tall of a blank we're going to have to work with. If there was a crack or something up there we want to remove that now, then we can design to our final bowl height. So I'm going to take the bowl gouge, point the flute at the rim, and close up the gouge so that the top edge is almost touching. Not quite. If you have maybe a 16th or a 32nd gap at the top, the top will never hurt you. I'm touching with the top edge. That won't hurt you. If you come in there with the gouge open, with the flute at like 45 degrees like this and plow into there, it'll roll the gouge right into that flat grain in there and maybe tear the bowl out of the lathe. So we want to keep it fairly closed up. And I take small bites, like 1/4 of an inch from the outside working in. A lot of people want to take the gouge, lay it over, and go back and forth and scrape it, and they never get it flat. You can't get rid of the bump that way. If you line it up, take a small bite and push it straight forward, you can go until it's smooth. And just work your way at it. And I just kind of pivot the gouge off my thumb and use a little leverage that way. You can work through some incredibly hard material that way. I just kind of smoothed it off. Now it's going to be torn. I'm going to try and clean it up. So to clean it, if you want to smooth it, have your handle level. Keep the gouge closed up. It'll smooth it across there. But the grain's going to be torn. If you want to clean it up, drop the handle. You've now got like a 45-degree shear angle on your gouge, and the chips will change immediately. And I'm actually pushing the gouge. You can push it or pull it. It'll cut both directions. And it's not going to catch as long as you don't open the flute up. I think some turners early on, they want to open the flute to see what it's doing, and if you do that, you'll have a catch immediately. So you got to keep it closed up. I took the corner off. I made a really sharp corner on there. I'm going to get rid of it right now. I don't want to bump into that because it'll cut you. So it's pretty clean on top. It's not 100% perfect, but I don't need 100% perfect right now anyway because I'm going to completely recut the top rim after I reverse it in the chuck. I just want to get it flat, make sure I've gotten rid of any knots or any cracks or anything that show up. Because once you cut that rough surface off, you may find something that you didn't see when it was rough. Okay. We've got the design here. So I ended up with a little accident one day in the shop. This was a complete, nearly finished bowl. I think I was trying to put finish on it or something and came off the lathe. Gave us a good demonstration piece though. This is kind of what my finished thickness looks like, my cross section. So the rim is fairly thick. You can see how the design is inset here a little bit, or actually outset a little bit. And then it's a little bit thick down here in the bottom. It would be nice if it was about 1/4 of an inch there, but if it's a little thicker, it's not a big deal. The piece is already dry. The thinner it is, the stronger it is. But anyway, that's kind of what I'm doing. You can see this reverse angle, this reverse curve here. It gives the rim a nice feel when you pick it up. It kind of makes a handle out of the rim. It's very difficult to cut. So I'm going to show you some ideas on how to make that work. If you want to pass that around. We're going to try and lay out an area here where we're going to put that design work. I'm going to try and clean this up. There's some ridges in there. One of the gouges we use on the inside of the bowl is the bottom feeding gouge. You can also use these on the outside, and they will cut really clean. So when we're turning the inside of the bowl, we use the left-hand side of the gouge. When we do the outside, we're going to use the right-hand side. We're going to cut up the rim and rub the bevel with the flute. The flute can be rolled over towards me a little bit. It doesn't have to be straight up. If you roll it in, it's going to catch. That was one of the things. I don't have a red marker. Glenn Lucas, when he is doing his classes, he makes his students put a red line right down the middle of his gouge, right down the flute. And usually, if you're turning, if you see that red line show up, you're getting into the danger zone there. On most gouges, that is not something you want to see. So if you kind of keep that rolled over a little bit, you would see it a little bit here, but not much of it. I'm only going to do this little portion here in the middle, because that's where we're going to work on our detail work. You see really quickly the need for the respirator. Some of those grinds really put that right in your face. Yeah. It's the one that's square on, it's barely radiused back on the wings. Right there. So the wings are pretty much almost straight up. The angle varies. I'm trying to find. The bevel angle varies based on what bowl I'm turning. So the handle doesn't hit the side of the bowl, if that makes sense. Sometimes this gets flatter or more sharper based on whether I'm doing a taller piece or a flatter bowl. The sharper this angle is, the more the handle is behind the gouge and it's easier to steer. But if you do a deeper bowl, the bar runs into the edge of the rim. So then you have to make that angle flatter or more blunt in order to get around the curve. So this tends to change a little bit. The shape of the wings being almost straight back doesn't change much. This one's parabolic. Yeah. I have found it to, most of my gouges I'm using now are parabolic. I do have a few old U-flutes, and there is several of them that sell bottom feeding gouges that are U-flutes, but I can make this work on a parabolic. Yeah, Glenn is using a 60 on his. I got his little chart that he made up, and this would be a GL6, and he's using a 60-degree bevel on there. I found mine is much sharper than that for most of my gouges that I can use. So it's a little bit sharper. My handle comes back a little bit more, so it's a little easier to steer. 60 degrees is, your handle's going to be, you're going to be like this to the wood, so it's a little harder to steer. Mine is actually back closer to this, so it's a little easier to, your handle's kind of behind it. It's easier to push it. But that's going to vary based on what you're turning. That actually didn't clean that up that well. So we're going to try something else. This is why we're going to show you some different ideas on how to try to clean up this torn grain. We're going to go back to our big heavy scraper that we cut the tenon with. If we lay this flat on the tool rest and cut it like we would do with an easy wood tool, which are presented flat on the tool rest, it's probably not going to improve that surface. It'll probably make it worse. But if I raise the handle, or if I lower the handle and raise that edge and get a shearing angle with this side of the scraper, we get a shearing angle, we may actually improve that with just a flat scraper. We're getting really nice little spiral shavings off of that. Nice and fine, which is what we want. The bad thing is when you tear the grain, you got to cut all the way to the bottom of it. So a lot of times it'll take several passes to get to the bottom of that torn grain. If you try and do it in a heavy pass, you'll just get more torn grain. So that's fairly simple to do. It improved it a little bit. This piece might be harder to cut than the one I shied away from. So that's a little better. The other thing you can do with all of these techniques is spray this with water and then cut it. Soak it. It'll help stiffen these fibers up a little bit. It'll raise the grain a little bit, and then cut it. But you got to cut shallow. If you cut deep, you'll go below the water, and it's of no benefit to you at all. Yeah. Soak it and get wet. It doesn't do any good. You could, well, I mean, we could try some, yeah, if that's okay. Yeah. We'll put some on here and we'll do a negative rake scraper on it. And I got to put a qualifier on that. If you want expert advice on a negative rake scraper, you got to see Tom's demo. I'm not an expert on it. I use it, but I don't know near as much about. I'm not as good at the angles and things as Tom is. So, if you want more information on those, go see Tom's demo. He has mastered the negative rake scrapers. So I sharpened this. It's got an edge. It's got a burr on it, and we'll go in here. Now notice I only did one side, so we'll see if there's a difference. This is the only scraper you can put flat on your rest, pull it across, and improve your surface. But they do not stay sharp very dang long. You have to resharpen these. This was actually just a regular bowl scraper for a long time, and I'd use it on the outside of the bowls before I cut the negative rake on top of it. Go ahead.
Alan, are you typically able to leave it on the rubber mat and do finish turning on the? Really?
It's tight enough. Cool. Yeah, they generally don't move. So that is improving it. It's getting a cut out of there. The edge is gone already. I mean, you get 10, 20 seconds. Is that about right? Yeah. With good steel, you get 10 or 20 seconds. If you use poor steel, you won't even get that long. So that's it works, but it's lots of trips back and forth to the grinder. Here's a grind that Glenn Lucas has been using recently. Stuart Batty has promoted the 40-40 grind for years. and it works really well. It's a sharp grind. It'll give you a clean finish on there. It is a true push cut from the bottom of the bowl up. In most cases, though, that needs to be sharpened freehand. Is there any jigs that'll do it? You don't know of any, Tom, either?
Actually, a lot of
Is there one?
jig makers will claim that you can get a consistent 40-degree grind all the way around, but the human body can make thousands of small adjustments as you grind,
Mm-hmm.
and the jig has a hard time doing that. So I would not want to say that there's not one that will. I will say I've never seen one that will.
Okay.
Almost done.
So this one, Glenn's advocating the 45 degree for two reasons. One, he's been able to figure out how to do this with a Wolverine jig, or the Varigrind. Sorry, it is setting 2 on the on the Varigrind. So you got setting notch 1, notch 2, notch 3 is the 55 degree sweatback grind that I have here that I was using earlier. Ellsworth's grind was 60. This is 55. It's so close you can't really tell the difference, and it fits the jig perfect. It's kind of a nice way to show people, set this jig up, you can get this result, and this way you can get 45 degrees with a jig, and it's very easy to sweep that and roll that around the grinder and get a good sharp edge. The other thing that he liked about this was the gouge clears the tailstock. The tailstock doesn't get in the way. The 40-40, Stuart almost always, when you see him demonstrating, does not have a tailstock on the lathe. He starts over here and cuts. So all of his work is done without a tailstock. I really highly advocate having the tailstock there as long as absolutely possible. That is a good insurance policy to keep that bowl locked in the lathe. So this is kind of a good benefit. There's two benefits here. One, you can sharpen it easy, and you can also keep your tailstock in place. That's the 45. It's fairly flat. Maybe just a tiny curve. Maybe just a little bit right at the bottom, but it's dang near flat. So the other thing I'm doing with this, going back to some more of Tom Worsing's things, this is sharpened with a 320 grit CBN wheel. So it's really, really sharp. You give it a little more speed. No, too much. Lathe started moving. If it's moving, you can't get a clean, you're not going to get a smooth cut out of it. So this is a true bevel riding cut. And there's a tiny little bit of torn grain right there. Just a little bit. No, can't zoom in that far. Can't zoom in that far. The camera's not as good as my eyes are. It reduced it by probably 95%. Without adding any water. If you add water, it's going to be even better than that. Okay. We'll move on. We'll cut some beads here really quick. Yeah, that's good enough. The other thing is you can use this. This gouge will shear scrape also. Put the handle way down low. It actually shear scrapes really well. And he shows this. If you can't get it with a push cut, you can shear scrape or shear cut with the gouge also. It works well both ways. Okay. We're going to go ahead and cut the beads in here real quick. We're going to use a small pointed scraper. Nothing fancy about it at all. We try to put them at the 1/3 mark, a third of the way down from the top, which means we're going to creep into this. We're going to creep into that just a little bit. Cut uphill just a little bit more. I have one of those golden mean calipers, but I didn't bring it with me. I forgot. It's got 3 legs on it, and top, bottom, and the 1/3, 2/3. We're going to eyeball it. So there's one groove. So I'm going to wiggle. Instead of just pushing the scraper in, I'm going to wiggle it in. Cut with each side. I'm going to go a little ways over, make another one, then we'll jump up here, make another one. If I do beads, I usually do 3. Trying to see whether I need to go up or down. We'll go up. That looks about right. So I got 4 V grooves. Now I'm going to make 3 beads out of it. So I'm going to take the scraper and raise it up and use the bottom wing as a shear scraper. And I'm just going to round the corner off. So because it's a shear scraper, and I just flipped the scraper over, I'm going to the other side. Now I can do the other side of the bead. Richard Raffin showed this years and years ago in one of his videos. You can make a bead of any size. And with the shear scraper, it cuts pretty clean and it does not catch as long as you don't stick the tip into the other bead. But the bevel will usually kick you away because it's a fairly blunt angle on the end of that scraper. It's not super sharp. You know, that doesn't rake back very fast. It's probably a 80-degree angle or something. But it cuts fairly clean beads. They're not perfect, but they're pretty clean. And actually, the fuzz in the bottom is easy to get rid of. This is some cloth-backed sanding belt, like 120 or something like that. A little bit of speed, shove it in the bottom of the groove, and let the smoke roll. There went the fuzz. It's nice and clean down in there. There's a tiny bit of torn grain. If you're that fussy, don't buy my bowl. Yeah, I know. Hopefully the smoke detector doesn't go off. Okay, we're going to grab we're going to look at this, and we're going to say the base is going to be about here. I kind of stuck my fingers in there. I think I have enough wood to make the base about right there. Let's see if that's halfway close to our 1/3. So that's a 13-inch bowl. That's 4.5. It's close enough. I mean, you could, if you wanted to measure it out and figure it out, you could do that. But for me, it's going to work. I could take just a touch off of there. Okay, we got that started. Now we're going to come in here and start cutting this outside curve. This lathe isn't exactly the right height. A little more speed. Now it's vibrating. That's better. Now I'm going to dive in and try and make that little relief that comes up to the bead. And actually, I'll come over here and just kind of sweep up to it. I'm going to put the light up here where I can see, get the gouge started, and just sneak right up to it. That was a shear, it's a shear cutting. It's an actual cut. It's not a scrape. Nope, there I jumped a little bit. I'm hitting handles on the lathe. The tool rest isn't in my way at all, but some of the handles were. This lathe's about 2 inches low, 3 inches low. So we're just going to, down here at the bottom, the curve kind of flares out a little bit just to lift the curve off of the table a little bit. So I'm trying to clean that up. That's not good. That's going to be torn. Now there's a spiral. Yeah. If that's what you wanted. So this is what we're here for, is to try and get rid of all this, try and get rid of all these problems. So we're getting close. There's some lines down there we're going to have to deal with. And some torn grain. One easy way might be to, one thing I don't do with this tool is turn very long with it before I sharpen it. Usually it's 2 or 3 cuts, and 1 or 2 cuts and it's back to sharpening. Even though it's really good steel, it's not as sharp as a brand new edge. You can tell that's sharper. So trying to get that curve like that takes a lot of practice, which is a lot of hours spent at the lathe. And when you don't get it perfect with that, just come back with your other gouge, sweat back grind, close up the flute, get the top edge as close as you can, almost touching, so it's not going to be aggressive, and come back in there and just wipe out those little bumps. So you don't want your handle flat because this will tear the grain. You want the handle dropped with your cutting edge pointing up. If your handle's about 45 degrees or maybe 30 down in here, it cuts really well, but it starts getting lumpy. You can't get as smooth a curve with the handle really straight up and down. About 45 is about the best compromise. A good cut, and you can still make a fair curve with it. And I don't always pull it. A lot of the times I'll push it through that curve because you've been pulling it that one direction the whole time, so the bounce keeps going that way. If you come at it from the other direction, sometimes you can go right through it. And it's the absolute lightest touch to make that happen. And we're just getting super, super fine shavings off of it. If we're getting big chips, we're doing it wrong. I'm going to wipe out some of this material up here at the top. It's just a push cut with, but it is sharp. Develop that curve at the top. Getting kind of dangerous there. I was really close to that really close to that bead right there. So we'll go back to the small gouge. Try and cut in here. So in some ways, I'm not advocating you have to do this with this gouge. It's another tool to put in your arsenal. It does exist. It can help get you out of a pinch after you have some time with it. Definitely improves it when you use the water. You can get rid of some of this last little fine tear out right here. There's just the absolute bare minimum amount. I used to have to deal with way more than that when I was shear scraping. Shear scraping works good, but it'll lift grain on some woods. It'll lift the grain, and on the side grain, it'll tear stuff out, especially in ash right in here. You'll get places on side grain, not so much end grain, where this one has a little bit more forgiveness on some of those types of woods. So that got rid of the torn grain up here. That surface is going to sand very fast. I would still start with, if I have any torn grain at all anywhere, I'll hit it with the 80 grit really quick. And then I'll hit it with 80 anyway, because it'll take care of the little bumps I have here. Because when you're running a gouge like this, a lot of times you'll get that little hard bump in there, and the 80 grit will wipe that off really quick on a piece like this. But it'll take a minute of sanding with the 80, and you're on to 120 and move your way up. You don't have to spend a ton of time grinding out that torn grain. You know, so you
said something that this lathe is about 2 inches too short for you.
yeah.
How do you get gauges?
We went like an inch or two above my elbow. I can just tell. I've turned enough of these on that one lathe. It's too short for me. It needs to be a couple inches higher to make it. Because I can stand at that lathe and make these cuts, and I don't have to bend over. And I'm also used to, my lathe is straight up and down on the front. So this leg sticking out is getting to be, it's in my way. But other than, I mean, it's just things you work with. But get the lathe up to where you're standing straight up when you're making cuts like this. If you got to move down a half inch, that's okay. But 2 inches is too much. But we made the cuts. It looks nice and clean. But try a lot of different things. Shear scraping, negative rake scrapers, push cuts with the gouges. And the other thing that is very, 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 very important, before you make a finish cut, sharpen your gouge. If you sharpened your gouge when you started turning the bowl, it's dull now. Go sharpen it before you start making your finish cuts, and you will have far better results. And I used to be part of the crowd where I ground everything at like 60 grit, 80 grit, and I've kind of shied away from that the last couple of years with the demos Tom did and the ones that Glenn did. Glenn was telling me, he's like, yeah, my coarsest grinding is 320. He says, so I tried it, and it has made a big difference. The gouges last longer too. They do not go away as fast, especially when you're sharpening every couple cuts. They will last a lot longer. So we were able to accomplish a lot of the work on the outside of the bowl where it was easy to get access to it. You can see right now when we put it over here, especially for somebody who's right-handed, this is harder to get to. If you're a lefty, do it on this side. It doesn't make any difference. You just don't have, with the chuck in the way, it's harder to get to some things. Okay, let's see how. It's pretty good. So if that's nice and tight in there, if you cut that tenon good, there shouldn't be any gaps between your jaws. If there's a gap in there, this thing will probably, if you have a catch, it'll come loose. It'll move. I was going to see if I could figure out where the high spot was at. Sometimes you can whack it with something heavy. It's close enough. If it's even off worse than that, I just leave it. I generally don't return the outside once it goes around to the front. It would have to be really far off, and I generally don't have that much of an issue anymore. I used to have problems with my tenons, but cutting them with a scraper, learning how to get that flat surface for the chuck to butt against, that made a big difference. Is that going to screw you guys up, or is that going to work? Okay. So that bowl that went around there has a pretty fancy rim on it. It has kind of an OG curve on it. The biggest thing I've done with my rims is, whether they're rounded like those, whether I do a fancy OG rim like that one, I try to not make the inside and the outside level. Because what usually happens is if you try to make it level, make it dead level. If it's just slightly off, it looks like you missed it. So with most of mine, I exaggerate it one way or the other. Most of the time, I tip them in, and it kind of draws your eye into the bowl. But a lot of them a lot of people who've turned a lot of bowls over the years, they said as a design aesthetic, either make them dead level or pitch them radically one way or the other. And some people completely round the rim over and make it smooth, which is fine if you want to do that. I'm leaving a hard edge that I just softened with sandpaper just to give me a little bit of a line of definition, kind of like you do in spindle work, just to give it some crispness and some detail. I try to make my details here as crisp as I can, just so it doesn't look like it's rounded over and just muddled and, looks like I missed the mark. This line clearly illustrates I hit the mark and I saved it. So it's just something I'm after. One of those details. I'm kind of around the company I'm known as a perfectionist. So it kind of continued into this. So you can see it's out around. It's not going to make any difference. Here in a couple minutes, it'll all be trued up. That's why I didn't cut the rim before, because I knew there's a good chance it was going to be off. So I'm going to take a little bit of the wood away with the big gouge. Remember, you have to approach this carefully because that side grain cuts way easier. And it'll grab your gouge pretty quick. I'm going to remove some of that wood. I'm going to start taking the inside out because I still have a shadow in there from the warped wood. I'm going to get rid of that so I know how thick my rim is going to be. So to do that, I'm going to roll the gouge over, close the flute, bring the bevel around so it's straight in, 90 degrees to the wood, and push it straight ahead. If you don't, it's going to skate that way. It'll ruin your rim. Once you get it started, you have just a little lip in there, you can roll the gouge, you can roll the flute open and push it. This is going to be fun. This lady's going to vibrate. There it skated just a little bit. This one's going to be challenging. Yeah, it's... Most of the time I don't have that. No. That might help. Something I don't have to deal with. I got a Vic mark and it's a rigid bolted headstock. I don't have that. Don't have that issue. That might have been some of it. We got, yeah, thank you. So we're going to cut the rim. We're going to round over this outside. Normally I use that 60-degree gouge for this. Yeah, I'm going to go back to that anyway. I'm going to use that on the interior. We're done with the 45. It doesn't work very well. You can't go around that curve with a 45 degree if the bevel's too long. The bevel angle doesn't work. So this is 55 degrees. It's a smaller swept-back gouge. So when I do this rim work, either cutting this rim or the undercut underneath it, I always go to a smaller gouge because they'll cut cleaner. I don't have hardly any overhang, so I don't have to worry about chatter, but the smaller gouge will cut cleaner and it'll cut that nice tight radius. All kinds. Some Hamlet. This is robust. My big bottom feeding gouge is from Carter. It's one of the Mahoney series. Some Henry Taylor stuff. I've got some Glazer stuff, new and old. Well, only new. My old Glazer gouge is that long. It's gone. So a little bit of everything. I use them all, like almost all of them. So if I can do it, I like to do this with a push cut all the way through. And not try to scrape it. Sometimes you're right a little bit on the other side. You would want to turn it away so you couldn't see it, so it won't grab. But that is totally clean. There's no. Luckily, I didn't get any rub marks in there. You could, if the camera was right, you could see the spirals showing up in here from that bowl chattering against that other gouge. So we've got a clean OG cut in here, and it's ready to sand. This is one spot that's really, really difficult to try to use a scraper on, because you're on the outside edge of the bowl and it wants, all the mass is gone. If you're turning a solid block of wood, do this part before you hollow it. That way this is supported. You could get a scraper in here and cut this and it won't, the block of wood won't be, this won't be moving. Mine is already hollow. This is weakened. So you have to do this early. I do it before I thin this part of the bowl. As soon as this is thin, you can't come back. You'll most likely blow the bowl up. Because I would turn this section, as you saw, this section's only going to be 1/4 of an inch thick or something. You have no support up here for this at that point. Okay, we got to try and hack some of this wood out of the middle. See what we can do. How are we doing on time? Okay. Better than last time. Good to know. The other thing that's kind of nice is this happens to be a 15-inch long tool rest. It gets you a lot of access deeper into the bowl and keep your banjo off the rim. So if you're having trouble with a 12-inch rest, being able to reach into the bottom of your bowl, something like this could be a big help for you. So just keep that in mind. Not trying to sell tool rests. That's not my deal, but after buying this, it has opened up some options for me that I didn't have before. I didn't even know there was one. So yeah, I know he'll be happy. So we got the flute at 45 degrees facing towards the center, and the handle's down a little bit. We're going to ride the bevel and that handle's just long enough. Before we get too far, I'm just eyeballing from one rim to the other across the tape measure. I got 4 1/8. Then I hold it up here. I got 3/4 of an inch yet, so I got plenty of wood. All kinds of wood. Yeah, I know. It's okay. The magic of TV, I got another bowl. I'm going to thin this up, but I'm only going to go part way. I'm going to try and leave some mass in the bottom so I can cut this section and not have it chatter any more than it already did. But this gouge is cutting better than their same grind. I don't know. I thought that one was sharp, but yeah, there it is. On my rough cuts, I don't really care, but in a minute, we're going to care. Okay. Let me see where we're at. This thing might wind up a little thicker because I think this is part of our problem. Had we filled that with epoxy, it would have given it some strength. Right now it doesn't have any. So whatever. We might just have to leave it a little thicker just for sake of speed. But we can still cover the same techniques that I would use, even though it's going to be a little thicker. That's really thick. Let me get one more pass starting right here. So one of the keys to being able to learn how to cut a smooth curve from the top all the way to the bottom is being able to pick a cut up anywhere along a curve and start and continue it. One of the really good spots to practice that is on your roughing cuts. Don't just blindly rough it out. Try to practice making a smooth cut a smooth curve on your roughing cuts. So I'm going to pick the curve up right here. I'm riding on the heel of the bevel, the back end, and then I'm just going to kind of ever so slightly ease the gouge into the cut and go around the curve. One of the other things you may catch me doing, just because it's a bad habit, I've done it for a long time. Do not back your gouge up this way. A lot of times they'll back it. When you back the gouge up, if you pull the handle around a little bit too quick, you'll get on the cutting edge and zip, right up the outside, right up the inside of the bowl. Because the cutting edge caught, you didn't have a bevel in contact and you weren't prepared, it'll just rip up the outside of the bowl. Do not back it up, pull it out, and start again. That's a really quick way to blow a bowl right off the lathe. We talked about the bottom finishing gouge on the outside. We used it there for a few minutes. Some bowl turners use it from this point all the way to the bottom. I have not done that for quite a few years. This undercut is pretty hard to do, and so I have just gone back to a standard 60 or the 55 degree swept back bowl gouge, and I use that to make this first third or so and make this undercut. It's a little bit more forgiving for me, and I can get it usually in 2 or 3 passes with a very sharp tool. I only make one cut, and then I sharpen. So the tool is extremely sharp when I cut this, and I get good results. It also has this bevel's. Normally I have an even shorter bevel. You can see this bevel is like 1/4 of an inch long. I've shortened it some, but I would probably shorten it even more if I was going to use it here on a finished piece. The shorter you make this bevel, the tighter the curve it'll go around, and the closer together the little lines will be that it leaves. When this bevel's really long, you'll have marks spaced equally the length of your bevel. So if you shorten them up, they'll be smaller and they'll be closer together, easier to sand out. So we're going to go in with the swept back gouge. We just cut the rim with it, so I'm going to sharpen it. So this one, right now it's set up for the 45 degree. You just go to notch number 3 instead of number 2. I'll go to this one. So we're at notch number 3 from the top. That's the 55 degree. Close. So if you want to look, I mean, these are, Glenn Lucas made these. He made these sheets up that have all the different, that have a lot of the settings. Each page is for a different grinding jig. The back one is the Sorby Pro Edge. The front side is the one-way Wolverine jig. And he's got another one for Craft Supplies Raptor or something. And then there's another 4th sheet for another one. If you look, these should be available somewhere on the internet. I don't know exactly who has them in the U.S., but if not, if you buy some tools from Glenn, you might be able to order one of these with it. This is the only one that I have. So, Glenn Lucas from Ireland. But he took the time to go through, take each gouge, and figure out all the settings on the different jigs. Nobody else has done that. So it's very.
If you take my sharpening class, I hand out a copy of that.
Okay, perfect. Go see Doug. He can take care of it, and he can show you how to do it.
So
Hey.
back up that part of the tape and delete the copy.
Oh, that could be. Yeah. Yep. Because he was using a Tormek for a long time in his shop. I think he still does, but yeah.
Hey, Alan,
Yeah.
how far in do you bring that? Is it 1 3/4, 2 inch?
One and 3/4 inch and 7/8. Just whichever one you do, make it consistent. That is where my jig has been set for 10, I don't know. I've had those bases on there for a long time. It's never changed. The gouges have made a little groove in there, but so it's probably closer to 2. But as long as it doesn't change, you don't take any more material off. I took nothing off the end of the gouge. All I did was make a fresh bevel. I got a fresh edge. So you don't have to take much steel off. I'm going to pull this around here to get me a little closer, better angle. Oops. When I moved into the new shop, I needed some lighting. I made a light that has 4 heads on it for my one lathe, long, 20 years ago. It's got 4, they're now LEDs, but they're like 100 watt equivalent LEDs. There's one on each corner. So the inside of the bowl is lit. The outside of the bowl, I don't have any shadows. And when I went to the new shop, I had 3 more lathes to light. So I went with track lighting. It works pretty good, but I'm having trouble finding intense enough lights to be able to light it from like 10 feet in the air. But I try to get lights in from multiple directions so I don't have any shadows inside. You've got to be able to see what you're doing. I try, yeah. I have been able to, but I'm going to show you ways you can try to use a scraper if you need to. Most people need to get a smooth curve. So we'll cover how to do that. I've cut all of those bowls simply with a gouge. There hasn't been a scraper in there. So this one's a little tricky trying to pick up this corner right here. And there's a little bump there. There's a little spiral there already. So we're going to have to get... What's that? Oh, he needs to zoom in. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. You got to go slow with this. You can't push it through there fast. And you can't take a heavy cut either. I got it started. I'm going to take a little bit of wood off. The other thing you can't do with this cut, you cannot push into the bowl. You have to push into the tool rest and in the curve. You can't push sideways or it'll bounce right off, especially when you have voids in the wood. They'll kick you. You'll start getting the spiral really bad. So you have to have the lightest amount of pressure against the bowl, and it's in the direction you're cutting. Because if I push, you'll hear it. But you're not hearing it when I'm cutting. We want to hear that clean cut that's at the end, not that, we don't want that vibration. I'm just trying to kind of pull the gouge away from the wood when it starts to vibrate. I left some steps. I'm going to go back and try and cut them off. Just the ever so slightest touch. You can see those shavings whipping by there. They're just really tiny. But what we're after, if you're looking in there, let's see if we can. What we're after is none of that. You can see some torn grain here. And there's just hardly any back in here where I cut it. So we're just trying to do everything we can to eliminate that. We can do even better than that if we wet that surface and cut it again. I'm not going to because of time. We'll just continue on to the bottom of the bowl. But I would go back to the grinder, sharpen the gouge again, wet this. I could keep a spray bottle with water in it. I just squirt that. And you only have to really do this area and 180 degrees right there. The two spots in the end grain. You can soak those two spots. If it gets somewhere else, it doesn't matter. It's not going to hurt anything. If it raises the grain a little bit here, it'll come out when you sand it. It's not going to hurt anything. You can put oil in here. For a while, Mike Mahoney was turning a lot of cottonwood bowls, and he was soaking them in walnut oil and then putting them on the lathe and turning them. You talk about a mess. You talk about a mess. Oil will work good, but it will make a royal mess out of your shop and you. I tried it for a little bit and I quit doing that. I just stick with water. It'll rust your lathe, but unless you have a robust, then you don't have to worry about it. We're going to work our way down to the bottom. So we had 7. We had 4 and an 8th. 4 and 1/8. So we come up here, measure 4 and an 1/8, 4 and 3/16. We got about 3/4 of an inch. I'm going to take a little bit off the bottom. Come on. I'm going to go in here and take some out of here right now. And that always used to be the last thing that I did. But I saw a couple of other guys do that, and it actually works pretty good for me. I now have a point to hit. I go from here to there. And I take 1 or 2 passes across the bottom of there. I try to take a 1/16, maybe an 1/8 of an inch off the bottom of that when I come around there, and I'm done. I'm at the bottom. What's that? My depth is set. I know what my depth is going to be. I cut to that point. I take a little bit off, and that's it. I thought it was really gutsy when I saw the guys do that. I think Mike did it. Mike might have shown that once. Maybe another bowl turner, but I was like, man, that's pretty gutsy, because I used to just keep whittling my way to the bottom, and you get a curve that goes like this, and then it goes, you can't make it fit. I could never get that concentric curve. Now I know I got to go from here to there, and it seemed to help make that process a little better. This is a big bottom feeding gouge, 5/8 inch diameter version. I need the extra heft to be able to reach even 3 or 4 inches off the tool rest. That small one will chatter. So you need a bigger gouge. On deeper bowls, you need an even bigger gouge yet. You might need a 3/4 or a 1 inch. I have some extra material here on this lower ledge. I'm going to roll the gouge sideways so the flute is facing level away from me. I'm going to use the right hand wing and just remove it. It is extremely efficient at eating that end grain. Much more so than the sweatback gouge. The sweatback gouge is in there chopping away. You're hanging on for dear life when you're down there. This thing just peels it out of the way. So that very abrupt wing that's on the side of this gouge, where did we go? Right here. So the left-hand wing is very abrupt. It's almost square. And it just peels that wood right off. It's a longer cutting surface, and it's almost square straight up and down this way. The left-hand side is slightly rolled. It's slightly radiused back. It's leaned back just slightly with a little radius on it. Now I'm going to take a pass right here. Get rid of these chips. I'm going to start my pass right here. That's a little bit thick for a finish cut. I'm going to try and remove a little bit of wood so the gouge is open slightly. Still going to have to deal with that bounce that's in there. I'm going to go to that point and stop. I'm going to come back, open the gouge up, That flute's at about 130 maybe. It's leaned over just a little bit. I don't generally run it straight up at noon, but it's leaned over just a little bit. And I'm going to rub the left-hand wing and ride it to the bottom. But I'm not going to push into the bowl. Put pressure, it won't work. So it's got to be just the ever so slightest touch. And freshly sharpened off the grinding wheel. Yeah, anytime you're going to make a final pass, sharpen that edge. That's actually a Carter Mike Mahoney bottom feeder. It's one of his signature ones, so it has this really heavy bar in the back and a short flute. It was made especially for this. If you have the flute coming all the way back, it's probably going to chatter. So you need this extra mass. For a while, there was some guys making interchangeable tip gouges where you could just buy a little 2-inch gouge and a solid shaft. It'd be perfect for this. You only wear out 2 inches of gouge, throw it away, put a new one in. Where this way, when you grind it back, it's done. But you really need this length to be able to do it. I got to change bases quick. Because I want the finer wheel. This one is freehand sharpened. Because it's an asymmetric grind, the jig won't replicate it. Unfortunately, it's one of those you just have to learn. So I'm going to come back. I'm behind. I'm going to try and pick up the cut right there where that line is at, but I'm going to start back here and try and come in behind it and pick up the curve and then go through it. So, but when I'm back here, I'm on the heel. I'm not cutting. Start moving forward. There the chip picks up. Most time I use an overhand grip. I'm trying to push through that vibration, but we're going to have to lighten up. Trying to put all my force down into the tool rest. So the gouge doesn't drop into that hole. Now I'm gonna change my grip a little bit because I'm getting over the rest further. So I came out above the bottom a little ways. Sometimes too, I'll go uphill a little bit. And kind of come down to center. So we got just a little bit down there to cut yet. This isn't bad up here. There's a little bump right here. There might be enough thickness in this piece left to try this. I wouldn't go any higher than this with a scraper though. So this is a negative rake scraper. Okay. Oh, that went quick. What? Oh, 8:30, not 9. 8:30 or 9? Oh, out of here by 9. So we can try to go right here with a negative rake scraper and see if we can improve that. You can definitely fair the curve, but trying to fix that torn grain is going to be tough. It's better, though. If you keep sharpening, though, and just use a very, very light touch, it smoothed the surface out, and it just barely tore the grain right there. Okay. So if we were going to, when you move on to sanding, one tip I'll give you there is, if you have the ability to reverse your lathe, sanding in different directions on different grits will improve the surface of your sanding. You can sand one direction forward, one direction reverse. You can sand in both directions with each grit if you want, but that takes a lot more time. I would go through and sand this bowl completely, and actually I put my finish on from the inside of the bowl to the bottom of my details while it's in the chuck, and I get it to a point like this bowl over here. I sand my salad bowls to 320. It's clean enough, it gives it a good finish. Going beyond 320 is, I don't feel it's quite worth it. If it's going to get used, it's going to get scratched anyway. You can have almost, that doesn't get a bottom out. That's fine. So I sand it to 320, put the oil on, let it sit for a few minutes, and then burnish it in with a paper towel or a rag. And what that does with the walnut oils, it'll set them really fast. In the time it takes to burnish this with paper towels or rags with it spinning, it's dry to the touch. And they will not give me that sticky, oily, nasty residue that I've heard so many people talk about when using the walnut oils. You put it on and burnish it, and actually it looks like, it gives you a pretty dang nice finish. Some of those have been finished for several years. That's why they're starting to look dull. This one has it's a satin sheen right off the oil. So but I don't do this part because I got to sand this little area right here when I finish the bottom. So I don't oil this until I get this finished. So my friction drive here is simply a chunk of wood on a faceplate with a piece of foam gasket on the front of it. This is some funky foam from Hobby Lobby, cheap stuff. It's like $1 a sheet. This is like the 1/8 inch thickness. It's not real thick, but it won't mar the surface. It's also white, so it won't leave a color in your bowl. It used to be white. Now it's got oil. It's had lots and lots and lots of oil on it. So I put it back in the same center mark.
Hobby Lobby might not have it anymore.
Well, that's possible.
They're cutting back a whole bunch of stuff.
Yeah, it's closed cell polyurethane foam, and we glued it on there. Pretty simple. Might have to find something else, but so it's in there. It's trapped, and you have access to the bottom of the bowl. You take a gouge. It's always a good idea to check your depth before you do this part. Unless you want to make funnels. Good ones can tell by sound right before it's a problem. So you can cut this out. You can do any amount of design work you want down here. I make mine nice, but I don't get too crazy with them. I do want the center slightly lower than this rim. I want the bowl to sit on the rim. I don't want it to rock on the middle. So I make sure that's cut a little higher. This is another place that I have used the bottom feeding gouge. It's the same wood here that we cut on the inside of the bowl. So it works really well. To come in here and cut a nice finish across the bottom. And you can make that pretty nice. Now you have access to sand all of this all the way around. If you couldn't turn this nub off, you could probably oil this part, burnish it in, and then maybe just do the bottom off the lathe. So if you have a problem with, if you don't have a way to hold this with cold jaws, or I actually use this drum chuck on my vacuum chuck. Right now I turn the vacuum on, pull a vacuum through the headstock of the lathe. This piece will hang on there. I can pull the tailstock away, turn that away, sand the whole bottom. That has been a game changer when I started using that turning bowls. It's greatly increased my efficiency. If you don't have that, sand everything you can here that you can reach while it's on the lathe spinning. Take it off the lathe. One great way to do this. Everybody has the sand, just about everybody has the rubber sanding discs on their drill. Put it in your drill press. And then you got two hands to sand your bowl. It's a really quick, easy way to do that. Trent has also got those, he advocates those little air body die grinders. Those little die grinders, you can put a little 2-inch disc in there and just sit there and just zip it off really quick. If it's longer than this, saw it off, do whatever you need to do to get rid of some of the bulk, but you can sand them off pretty quick. So don't let that distract you away from having a nice finished bottom. There's really easy ways to make this happen. And so you can see the tenon had no reflection on the size of the base of this finished bowl. Let's see how close I did eyeballing it up on top of the lathe where I left it. So it's 12 and 4. Pretty close. Pretty close. You know, you do enough of them, you develop a sense of where they should be. For a long time, they were too big, and my forms were kind of flat on the outside. They were still nice, but the bottom was too big. And then eventually they started shrinking, and then I started getting a nicer curve, and you can just see how that comes together. It's a nice look. I mean, that's kind of how it's going to look when it's sitting on the table. It's still got that stub on there, but it lifts the bowl. This little lip right here just lifts the bowl a little bit off the table and just makes it a little more graceful than if the curve runs right into the table. It's just something I've been doing for a while. Well, the nub helps lift it up too, but you know, like I was saying about it, you know, that size base is not very good for utility wise. So that, I mean, oh yeah. Does anybody have any questions? Nope.
Early on, you said something about if you make the bowl thinner, it's stronger.
They will flex instead of cracking.
The question is, why is a thinner bowl stronger?
The reason is because the thick wood won't give. So there's a bowl over there that Jim Bissett made that was a 1/16 of an inch thick. That bowl will flex. This one, because it's 5/8 of an inch thick here, will more likely crack if it hits the ground because it doesn't have the give.
Okay, any more questions? Thank you very much, Alan.
Okay, you're welcome.
Yes.